Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us for the session today on COIL. Just a real quick overview of the agenda for today. We're going to start with our intercultural activity, as we always do, this time on civil discourse. Hopefully everyone has had the opportunity to view the YouTube video as well as the activity that went along with it. Then we're going to get right into what is basically I'm going to follow the same outline as what we had in the modules. We'll first start by talking about finding partners. We'll talk about the tech tools that you all are using specifically. So I'm kind of going to be addressing some of these in abstract because I feel like the modules covered most of the content, but I want to get feedback from you all. Finding partners, tech tools, design sequence, and then I have a little quick kind of collaboration brainstorming activity that's just meant to kind of loosen the gears on what it means to create a collaborative activity. And then we'll have some more time there at the end for some further discussion. So just real quick, want to make sure we've got everybody. I saw a couple more people logged in. Okay, so let's dive into our intercultural activity. And I want to share my screen. So this activity is exercising openness. Of course, we're talking about civil discourse. So, one of the things that Destin talked about is listening and that willingness to listen. If we look at the capstone for openness, there's two specific behaviors. One is the fact that someone is initiating contact or engagement or interaction and developing those interactions. And then the second one is suspending judgment. So those are the two important elements of intercultural openness: is a person's willingness or kind of proactive engagement. And then the other part is suspending judgment. And that's really the part that we're going to be focusing on with this particular activity. So for this one, I'm going to put you in your breakout rooms for about 10 minutes to discuss at least two of the questions that I have up here. And this is already an abbreviated list from what was in the activity. So how do you feel about Destin's take on civil discourse? What if you were to interview the president? Were there any historical political events that influenced how you view civil discourse? And how is understanding conflicting perspectives beneficial to you? And think about it within the context of your own culture. Because again, a lot of times when we start talking about culture, we often think at the national level. People have different cultures who are from other countries, but we need to recognize the way that our own culture, our own national culture, and then subcultures break down further. So thinking about conflicting perspectives within your own culture. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. And again, I'll put these questions into the breakout rooms so you'll have them when you're in there. But I'm going to go ahead and open all rooms. And as people migrate into those, I recognize that some people won't have been assigned anything, and that's maybe because you hadn't RSVP'd through Outlook. So let's see who we need to move. And get my spreadsheet open here. Okay, so Stu, I think I was going to put you in room. So I guess I can't create new rooms, can I? Richard.
Got it.
Okay. Okay. And Inez, did you not receive yours? I can't hear you. Sorry. Oh, she did. Okay.
Yeah,
And
I did receive mine. I only sent you that message because it seemed like I came in right in the middle. Was I very late to our session?
just a couple minutes. No, you weren't very late. No.
Okay, all right, good. All right, yeah, I'm gonna join my breakout room.
Okay, great. Let's see, and I need
Yeah,
who
that
ended
happened.
up in which group. So, welcome back. I think we're all here. Maybe one or two stragglers, but it looks like everybody's here. Let's go ahead and go into our fishbowl. Inez and John and Heidi were gracious enough to agree to do fishbowl today. Thank you. And then everybody else can just stop their video.
I thought you asked me to be in the fishbowl as well.
Well, I did, Stu, but for Thursday.
Oh, then I will.
And I believe me, I have trouble keeping that stuff straight, especially, sending those things out. And again, thank you all for agreeing to do this last minute. So let me share my screen so we can see our questions here. I want to hear about what you discussed in your groups. So I'm going to start with first, having had your discussion, having discussed the questions about Destin's video, how did you feel in those conversations?
Well, I would say I felt hesitant sometimes to share my views, because when we talk about civil discourse, it's often something that you have to be deliberate about when you know there's going to be a topic that's very controversial and that people are going to be emotional about it. And so even talking about what does it mean to civil discourse and trying to interpret the video, I was like hesitant about what I was going to say. And I would say among our group, we were confused about how to relate that particular video with kind of everything else that we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. I'll share very briefly that while everyone was in their breakout room, Margaret and I were also discussing the activity in politics. And, I admitted that I don't know if I can do civil discourse right now. I'm kind of burned out. It's really hard, especially the way things are right now. But I think this question is all the more appropriate. How do you feel about this topic? You're in this group having this conversation virtually because we're in a pandemic, but also this is an election year, and also all of the things that are going on in our society, talking about how do you do civil discourse with all of this?
Yeah, in fact, in our group, we did talk about the fact that sort of what you were just saying, Dan, that it's depending on the topic and of course how your opinions are about it, you may actually choose not to engage depending on how, and depending on the context as well. Are you talking to, family members that you already know that they're completely on the opposite spectrum, so it's like not even worth your time maybe or your energy to engage, but then maybe you're in another context with colleagues or it's somewhere where you feel like it's more appropriate maybe to engage because it's, the topic or whatever it is, it makes it more sort of easier to engage in a type of civil discourse. But many times, depending on the topic, some of my colleagues and myself included, I guess, we may choose not to necessarily engage unless there's some, personally, I can speak from my experience. If I'm facilitating this type of activity, say I teach a multicultural teamwork class for engineers, if I'm facilitating an openness activity, I find it a little bit easier just because I'm guiding, people and what it means and how it feels to be open, and watching something that is like really, really different. Say a minority student watching something from a white supremacist rights group, for example, white male groups. We did an activity like that last semester, but because it becomes an activity, it's a little bit more maybe artificial in some sense, like you're doing it as an exercise similar to this, but when you're actually engaging, like what Inez was saying, with someone on a one-on-one or personal basis, it becomes a little bit tougher to
Yeah.
decide.
Yeah, sometimes the civil thing to do is not have the discourse. If you recognize that your ability to engage objectively and dispassionately might be compromised, maybe the best thing to do is
Yeah.
not have that conversation. The other thing I want to point out is, this activity specifically brings up politics. Thankfully, most of us in our COIL programs are not going to be discussing politics, right? So I think it's good to start with a topic that can be often very fraught with conflict and strong emotions and feelings when thinking about the skills of openness and remaining objective and non-judgmental. Starting with the hardest things to practice that makes it that far more easy to have regular conversations about the project that we're working on in engineering or technology, and being objective about those things when we disagree on how the project should be done or something like that.
And if I may add a little bit, so from my experience working with students, between US students and say Latin America or Spain students, it's interesting too, and it's something that we can make our students aware. In some cultures, the young sort of college students are very active actually and engage in politics, and sometimes they would bring up topics like this. In fact, I hear this from my students every semester. So they will be surprised that they're actually engaged in some activist type rally or something, and they would bring out the ask about Trump or the president or whatever, right? Or politics all the time, where they themselves may not feel very comfortable talking about those things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just something that came to mind, that sometimes if we're doing COIL, we also have to be aware of how sort of our, in general, population feels about certain things and discussing and engaging in civil discourse, and acknowledging that in other countries, the young college students are actually very engaged in civil discourse and may even welcome that. And
that's a really good point. Thank you, Heidi. So I'd love to hear from John.
I think following up on that same comment, I have a VAIL program with 2 universities in Peru, and I think the underlying theme of or thread of many of our conversations is often framed in social justice. So the civil discourse has a base stronger, I think, in terms of social justice and what that means to the students and also to the faculty members that you're collaborating with.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we've, I think our group had a problem connecting the final video with the rest of this. It just seemed to be a major disconnect and a disruptive one, because there were so many wonderful things at the beginning, and this seemed to be ill-timed and hard. But I shared something that when I was trying to reflect on it and remembering something, there was a quotation from President Lincoln in his inaugural address that in the final part was a plea, a very strong plea. And I think to essentially say that the lack of civility or the lack of civil discourse isn't new, right?
Right.
And not only this country, but other countries have undergone through it. I think what would be meaningful for me would be, how do you take this type of challenge into selecting not the partners, but the countries or the partner countries that we do? Is there a showstopper criteria that we put it on pause and revisit at a later date?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
We had a proposed project for this year to go to a study abroad to Poland, and right now it's between the pandemic and their own political situation in Poland. It just isn't wise for us to have too many. So you put it on pause, but how do you maintain that relationship?
Yeah, that's really hard. And like we were saying, I think sometimes backing away and not having that conversation for a little while is the smart play. But yeah, that is a challenge. How do you back away from situations that may be, a little too overwhelming, yet still maintain those relationships? Because, when things do change, you might be ready to come back to those opportunities.
In some cultures, though, that the decision, or almost the comment is made somewhat gently, but in establishing a partnership is there's a ask or question that is, are you in for the long game, or are you just for this project?
Mhm.
And if it's just this project, it seems to cut the connection pretty quickly. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that you have this combination of events occurring,
Mhm.
and you may not be knowledgeable about that culture, how sensitive it is.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you
Thanks.
for that part. Yeah, that's good to keep in mind. So moving on to some of these other questions, what did you learn, and this question specifically, what did you learn about how you might, I'm kind of combining this with the what if or what next, how you might discuss civil discourse with your students? And again, I'm referring back to the idea that this particular activity focused on politics, but in your COIL projects, your teams of students will likely not be focusing on politics. As Heidi pointed out, it might come up. But how would you talk to your students about civil discourse, suspending judgment, and openness?
I'm going to invade from outside of the fishbowl.
Yes, please.
But I think something really valuable for students is to make them aware that, like, we know in America we have these things, religion and politics, like you don't talk about in polite company almost, and helping the students understand that what's fair game and what's not fair game, it may change depending on the culture, and you don't want them to get into trouble. I've had a study abroad trip where some students got actually a little concerned about conversations they were having because they didn't quite understand what was sensitive and what wasn't in the context they were in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've had similar conversations back in my previous career, teaching German, explaining to American students that, this impression that Germans can come off as very overly direct and almost rude in some of their statements, explaining that this is both a cultural and a linguistic difference, that because of the Germans' ability to transition from formal language to informal language, it allows them to carry on conversations about very, very passionately about topics that they have strong opinions about, but they can do it in such a way that the other person is not confused about you're disagreeing with me is not an attack on me because of the formal language you're using. It allows us to have that barrier and allows us to have a conversation about something that we can disagree on, which is why I often tell my students that the word for conversation in German or discussion in German is the same word for entertainment. Germans very much enjoy and see it as an entertainment to debate and argue and have these very lively conversations. And that kind of, freaks American students out sometimes. They're not prepared for that. And sometimes the reaction is, oh, they're attacking me. Whereas the other side of the discussion, this is fun. Let's debate it. So yet cultural differences can cause some culture shock and irritation. So that's also something that we need to make our students aware of.
So Dan, I'm really glad that you brought up this point, because when I was doing the pre-workshop work, there were questions like, when was the last time you had a civil discourse conversation? What do you think are one of the barriers? And for me, one of the biggest barriers is that I feel flooded with emotion when someone disagrees with something that I hold to be so important, right? Like it's a personal attack, even though, rationally I know that it's not. So to get to your question, how would we facilitate civil discourse in our classes? Maybe the first thing we could do is have a conversation with the students about what they think are barriers for them, because everyone's going to have different barriers to that civil discourse. Have the students think about what are barriers to themselves engaging in civil discourse. And although, I don't teach a political science course or anything like that, but my course is going to be about environmental sustainability. And there are cultural and political differences that lead to different strategies and different attitudes about that in countries. So it will be an engineering course, but I think politics will come into it.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. It's a very good point. It actually gets to what next. What do you do with this information? You make a really good point about we need to prepare our students with how to have these conversations before those topics come up, right? They need to have the
Right.
tools and strategies before conflict arises.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, actually, following this, that in fields like engineering and maybe polytechnic, if you have a project that is going to actually be implemented, or a prototype, or even thinking about how solving a grand engineering challenge or things like that, then you can tie it precisely that way, talking about the stakeholders and engaging in civil discourse from that perspective, right? And understanding that the implementation of a specific solution may be hindered by things like politics and stuff like that. So the connection can be, you can make it a little bit more relevant to a student to say, yes, this can actually affect your work, your implementation of a project, your implementation of a solution, if you don't engage it with the community and understand exactly what works in that context. So that's how I would do it in my classes, at least.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that, because stakeholders can have very different interests and it has nothing to do with politics. Sometimes they just have directly conflicting interests in a project. So that is when you would have to have civil discourse to resolve it.
Yeah.
Well, this is great. I'm going to stop sharing here and welcome everyone back from the Fishbowl to join us. And if anyone has any other thoughts they want to add to this, be happy to hear that before we go on to our next topic. Again, this is an activity about openness. So a willingness to engage in these conversations and an ability to suspend judgment are the key points of this. And I think, as we discussed, preparing our students for that and finding ways to practice that is very important, because it is a hard thing to do, even when you know how to do it. As has been pointed out, when you feel very strongly about something, emotions can get in the way of making rational decisions and remaining civil. So any opportunity we can give our students to practice openness will help them be more prepared for those conversations. But again, explicit discussions about how to have civil discourse, I think, are equally important, whether it's providing that netiquette rules of conduct or specific strategies for how do you deal with the conflict when it arises. Which I will mention, I'm also going to bring this up again in the teamwork workshop as well, dealing with issues of when conflicts arise as well. Okay, so the next part is we're going to get into these three areas: finding partners, tech tools, and design sequence for COIL. And one thing that I think is going to be really valuable, I have my own questions for the group, but many of you are far along in the design of your COIL, already running your COIL programs, or maybe have even done them in the past. I want to defer to your expertise and your experience and your knowledge to share with your colleagues here, because you have specific insight into these things that they may not. So I'm going to start with finding partners. So whether you have a partner already or you're still looking, I'm hoping the conversation around this will benefit both sides. So the first question is, how do you go about identifying what are your preferences for a partner? How do you figure out, what country do I want to look at? Do I want someone in the same discipline or another one? What are your thoughts on that? Or just your own experience?
Dan, this is Chen.
Mm-hmm.
My personal experience is to find a good working partner will be with the same background, same discipline in another country, so we can have more intercultural activities or understanding or learning process there. So we used to use J1 scholars that we hosted before, not right now. And those J1 scholars has been our good contacts in China or from Taiwan, helping us to find universities or students that we can expand from one to another. And of course that we don't work with one university only, we work with different universities. But we used a snowballing process starting with J1 scholars.
Yeah, and I really liked that example of the network of J1 scholars that you have access to here at Purdue. We have hundreds of visiting scholars every year, and practically every college has visiting scholars in it. So even if you personally don't have contact to those visiting scholars, there is someone in your college that can put you in contact with visiting scholars and maybe even able to help you narrow it down to a scholar from a particular country. So that's definitely one network. And that's the next step is, what are those existing networks that you can tap into to help you find a partner? So some of the things that were mentioned in the module were, conferences that you've attended where you've met colleagues there, or professional associations that you belong to. What other existing networks have some of you tapped into to find a partner?
In our College of the Polytechnic, we have an Office of Globalization, and in that they have strategic partners. So there's financial incentives to continue to develop those strategic partnerships, and the committee often then evaluates the status of those relationships. So having those, going through formally the establishment of those partners in terms of the institutional partners, and then within those it provides the network. Yeah, and it's such a great resource that the Polytechnic has. Previously Robert Cox, but now still Elizabeth Brajas and Misty Clue they're wonderful. I mean, I've worked with them a number of times, and they do have a lot of contacts and a lot of experience helping develop those. So certainly within your college, within your unit, those are great resources. And kind of connected to that, if your college doesn't have a global office or a study abroad office, there is the university study abroad office as well. Not to suggest that they aren't busy with their own work, but certainly this year work has slowed down for them. They have the capacity and the desire to help faculty and staff make connections in other ways so that they can help students have these international experiences. So that's another one. And
also, well, engineering works similar to a Polytechnic minus the financial incentive, I think. So you guys are, yes, always ahead of us, I think. Don't say it. Don't tell anybody I said that, but I think I look up to you and Elizabeth and everything, because I work in the similar office, but in engineering. Anyway.
Heidi, you're being recorded.
Oh my God. Can you edit it? No, I'm kidding. Well, we do have some other incentives that come from Silmar and IP, of course, like this training and things like that, but I just wish we had more stuff. I have to be careful what I say. Anyway, so what I was going to say is you can also, if you're just interested in wondering, in case you don't know this, wondering about, I wonder if, I don't know, some university in Australia would have something with Purdue already, or any type of MOU or letter of intent, you can always, there's a database publicly available online. You just go to Purdue Global Linkages, and you can look by country, and you can see all the agreements that have been signed by Purdue, including study abroad exchanges or MOUs, but at least you know, okay, there's already some connection with Purdue, and you can even see by college, okay, agriculture signed it or engineering signed it. You can filter it by college and see which agreements have been signed, which ones are active. And even if you have a specific interest to work with a partner in any country, a specific institution or university, the agreement may have sort of expired, but that doesn't mean you cannot rekindle that relationship, and you can always, there's a process to start the request to open a new letter of intent or MOU or things like that. So it's not limited necessarily to to an agreement that has to be active. I'm just saying. So we have faculty all the time saying, I'm interested in working with this specific institution, and then we sort of help them start the process. But at least it's a good database for you to see what agreements have been signed in general.
That's really helpful, Heidi. I was vaguely aware of that, but I need to add that one to the module as a resource for those who still haven't found partnership.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Yeah.
That's great. So the other resource that I've made available, you can fill out the partnership bulletin if you're really struggling with finding a partner, and I can get it out to the SUNY COIL Global Network, Global Partnership Network. That's another avenue that we have now that we've made that connection with the SUNY colleges in New York. So there are organizations like that. There's a new one, Bound International, that also does partnering programs. SUNY does kind of like a speed dating fair where you can go and meet other people who are looking to do COIL programs. So there's those opportunities as well. Okay, so did anybody have any other additions for finding partners or want to share their experience about finding a partner or any other information before we move on?
Listserv. I mentioned on the discussion thread that I found mine on Listserv. There's this professor, he each semester, about 2 or 3 times a year, he always lists the same program over and over again. Mm-hmm. And this is the first time I actually thought of it. I thought of doing it seriously.
Yeah.
So there's, it was an existing program, just kind of plug into it.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. I had forgotten that you had mentioned listservs as another network. Any kind of network you can tap into, you would be surprised. The interest is out there, especially now. So definitely take advantage of those. Thank you for mentioning that, Jonathan. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one, which is tech tools. Again, in the module, I offered a number of specific examples of tools. And the nice thing is that there are all those taxonomies out there that align a tool to a specific task to help you kind of figure that out. So I'd like to hear from you all about the tools that you've chosen, and if you have a specific task that you've chosen for, maybe sharing those as well. And I think we're all aware of Zoom and Teams and things like that, but are there any, like I came across, had never used before, Padlet or Kahoot, which were some neat software programs and apps that are out there that can be used. And I know WhatsApp is also being used quite a bit, just to allow students to have kind of a personal connection.
If I can ask a question, if anyone has, so I'm collaborating with some folks in China right now, and we've been using WebEx and some basic conferencing tools, but the firewall of China is one of those things that's always a challenge. If anyone has any suggestions specifically for Chinese tools that might be more effective, I would love specific suggestions that direction.
Perhaps TikTok could just record videos.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, TikTok might be possible. As long as it doesn't get blocked here, that's the other consideration. And sometimes we have to get creative, and whether it's just relying on the basics of email, also other creative avenues that are maybe, how should I put this, a little more, you need to be a little more cautious with, but I've found that many Chinese students are very adept at the use of VPNs to get around some of the issues with using certain software programs. So you might actually rely on their expertise. But the other thing to consider is the key component of a COIL is that collaboration, and you've got a partner that you're working with they will also have, specific insight into what works well that they've used in their country, and then trying to find the overlap there, the connection of what works for them. Can it also work for us? The last thing I want to kind of mention about using technology, the holy grail would be finding one platform, and it's a platform that both sides can use and no one has an issue getting into it, and that it serves all of our functions. And LMSs try to do that with having assignments and discussion boards and different ways to do that, but LMSs present other problems. I think realistically there is no one platform, but the mantra that I frequently use was handed on to me, and I repeat it all the time, is keep it stupid simple. Is keeping the number of platforms and apps to an at a minimum of what is necessary, and not going beyond that. And having said that, things like Padlet and Kahoot, you can build those into existing platforms that you're using, just putting the link in the platform. And yes, it might take them someplace externally, but the way they're accessing is through one central place. Any way that you can do that to consolidate technology and make it more easily accessible is going to be better for the students. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, I'm going to move on because we are, as always, short on time. The next part is design sequence. And with that, we have icebreakers, collaboration, and reflection activities. So I just want to make a few comments about each of these. And again, at the end, welcome some feedback from you all and insights of what you all have been doing. For icebreakers, something that's important to consider is a lot of times when we hear the word icebreakers, we think about, oh, it's just a fun getting to know you activity, which it absolutely can be, but it can also do so many other things. You can use icebreakers to help build trust among your students and help them develop personal connections. Those self-awareness activities where you have students fill out information about themselves and then share it with their teammates and with their partner. Learning about your partner is going to build trust and build those personal connections and help students discover, things that they have in common interests. The other thing is, again, this is my field. It can be used to practice intercultural competence. So some of you have already voiced concerns about how do I build intercultural competence into an already full curriculum. Using jolts and icebreakers, real quick, fast activities that you can use to start your synchronous sessions is a great way to introduce some intercultural competence activities and practice into your curriculum. And then the other thing I would mention is we've talked a lot about that attending to our students' emotional needs, using an icebreaker as an orienting kind of ritual or practice that you do every single time you meet. And I'm going to use a very basic example. My 5-year-old is attending kindergarten virtually, and every class meeting starts with the same ritual where she has the students kind of do a meditative breathing followed by kind of a daily affirmation. I'm ready to work. I'm going to be a good friend. And of course, this is for 5-year-old, but you might consider something along those lines of just having kind of a, let's get ourselves in the right headspace before we start. So I have all my materials, whether it's an affirmation or a checklist or something. And even if it's something like meditation or self-centering, that kind of centering yourself activity, it might be the only opportunity your students have all week to do something like that and have a little bit of self-care built into the class. And that will also, again, add to that feeling of connection with their peers as well. So that's something to consider when you're designing icebreaker activities. And I think it was, I hate to pick on you, but I think it was Janet who said, I hate icebreakers. and I completely understand that. They can be challenging to implement.
So Dan, I have in the past attempted to Google for like good icebreaker activities, and I get things for kindergartners. Is there some sort of encyclopedia of excellent icebreaker activities for adults?
Specifically for intercultural, and I'll just share the screen real quick so you can see the the cover of this book. Tiagi, the same one who does our, who created our debrief questions, also has an entire book of jolts that are, a jolt is just a short activity, and most of them are geared towards intercultural competence. We have a copy of it in Silmar's office that I'm sure we'd be happy to loan it. I think we might have multiple copies, but a lot of them are already in the hub in the digital toolbox. So you can go into the hub in the digital toolbox and actually just search for jolts, or you can search for an activity that is shorter than 15 or 20 minutes, or even less if you wanted to. So that is a really great resource to find some of these icebreakers as well. Okay, the next part of the design is collaboration. So the key term that I want to use when you're thinking about designing your collaboration is finding a balance. You need to have a balance when you're planning, collaborating with your partner, professor, or instructor, that you have equal input into the outline of your program. You want to find a balance of finding a neutral ground to meet and work. So again, going back to technology, you want to make sure that everyone involved has equal access to that. You know, one of the issues with hosting in your university's LMS is there's kind of a power dynamic. This is our bright space and you're a guest here, right? So that kind of creates some, even on the subconscious level, some power difference that could actually generate some conflict, or at least mistrust, or even just anxiety or concerns. So finding a neutral ground to work together it can be very valuable. Group size, you know, again, going back to this idea of conflict, what can often cause conflict is when one group has greater numbers than the other group that they're working with. So anytime you can equalize that, even within teams of your whole program, that's also important. We've already talked about kind of outlining rules for engagement, making sure that everyone understands how they're expected to interact with one another, even down to choosing what language are we going to work together in, you know, for this project. Unfortunately, you know, a lot of domestic students only have access to one language, but is there a way that can be mediated for non-native English speakers? So trying to strike a balance with that as well. And then the final thing I would say about collaboration is this piece of advice from my colleague Aletha Stahl. She said, allow students to connect as much as possible. So not just in that collaborative space where they're working on the project, but also socially or personally. Allow them to have spaces to connect, whether it's encouraging them to use WhatsApp or other social media to connect as well. Does anyone have thoughts or suggestions about this before I move on to the next? I know I'm kind of rushing along, so I don't want to miss anything.
I think the most common language to use is broken English.
Right. Needs to have its own category.
Seriously, when I used to work in industry, that's how it was. I mean, the engineers working on complicated projects, but across different time zones and cultures and languages, but everyone was using broken English.
Yeah, yeah. You know, one thing that I did, I did a program for the Polytechnic with visiting scholars, and it was focused on intercultural competence. It was meant to help visiting scholars kind of assimilate and engage in the local culture. But one of the things that I try to do as much as possible, and of course there are limitations to this, time limitations and just access, but even just using, I hate to even endorse this as a former language teacher, but even just using Google Translate to translate some documents, even to just have kind of a root. I know Heidi's shaking her head over there.
Oh my God, what? Okay.
I will say this. I used Google Translate, and then I asked a native speaker, can you look through this and get rid of anything that's ridiculous?
Yeah.
But again, there's time and access. Is that possible? But I did find that the non-native speakers, the visiting scholars from China and Korea, really appreciated just having that gesture of, I'm gonna at least translate this so you have kind of touch points in the language. When I'm talking about it in English, you can somewhat follow along. Even something as small as that might be helpful. And certainly the more time you can put into providing documents in multiple languages, the better. But I will again say, even just doing a little bit of it goes a long way. So I encourage that. But I'm right there with you, Heidi. Google Translate is terrible. Okay, and then the final piece of the design is reflection. So for this, I want to open it up as questions. So what will you have your students reflecting? How will you have them reflecting? So will they be doing self-reflection, like writing in a journal, or are they going to be reflecting on their successes and challenges? So let me back up. Will they be self-reflecting, reflecting about their own experience and how they're kind of internalizing, as opposed to reflecting on the successes and challenges with local peers and professors? So how they're, as a group, reflecting on that interaction? Or are you going to have them reflecting on experiences of their team that they're working on together? So rather than the whole group, just their immediate team. And then the manner in which they're reflecting, whether that's individual, writing in a journal or something like that, or having whole group discussions where you debrief and break down an assignment or an activity or a piece of the collaboration, or again, having them just in teams. So what are your approaches? How are you thinking about reflection in your programs?
So something that I've had a lot of experience and success with undergraduates doing these type of intercultural programs is having small group discussions, because it's a balance between being comfortable talking a lot, which adds to the richness of this discussion in that small group. I think in a whole class discussion, people kind of hold back because they think someone else will say something. And then if it's just a one-on-one discussion, people also tend to be reluctant. So I find groups of 4 tend to lead to very lively and insightful discussion where students are still willing to share their personal insights as to what they've gained. So for me, it's like small group guided discussion.
Yeah. And I think maybe some of you all will have hopefully experienced some of this in our breakout rooms. That's a really great place to have those reflections. I'm curious if there's anyone who feels like, well, reflection, we don't need to give a lot of attention to it, maybe just a brief reflection at the end of an activity, or is it more of a, what role is reflection in your collaboration? Is it more robust, or is it just kind of this is a good way to wrap things up?
If I may ask a follow-up question to Ines. So
Yep.
These guided 4 or 5 person discussions, did you schedule them on a regular basis, or how often? What was the frequency?
Well, so this was during a short-term study abroad, and I basically scheduled it on a long bus ride between cities. So they had nothing else to do. There was no excuse not to participate. And I just said, here's the schedule. I'm going to meet with groups of 4 every half hour. Here are the questions you should be ready to discuss. So. Yeah,
that's great. Captive audience is always good.
Captive audience.
Yeah, our students would just fall asleep on the bus. But something that we tried as a different approach was having the students keep journals. And so we would give them, this was again on a short-term study abroad, but I used it in other contexts too. We'd give them sort of a series of questions to prompt them to write, because most students don't have any practice keeping a journal. So if you ask them, answer this question, they're more happy to do it. And so we would sort of have a set of questions suitable for early in the trip, and then in the middle of the trip, and then at the end of the trip. And I think I'm planning to adapt that for a COIL experience to again prompt the students to sort of think, who are we about to interact with? And then at the end, how did that go? What did we all learn?
Yeah, that's a great approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
In a similar fashion, I integrate reflection posts at the end of every day into our short-term study abroad. If it's in the syllabus, they tend to take it more seriously, and I indicate that it's even if it's just a paragraph, it's necessary, and you can post it in the evening before you go out if you want. But it's nice to be able to see people's reflection of the day and what they enjoyed most, because it's hard to get out of them immediately after an excursion. And I set up a WordPress blog for them if they aren't comfortable with posting on social media.
That's great. I hate to cut this conversation short. We've run over time already. I have to keep reminding myself to check the clock because these conversations are really great and I think helpful for everyone. I hope everyone agrees with that. I do want to encourage you all in the post-workshop reflection. Share your experiences, share things you've already done in creating your programs. That is really where the most valuable information is going to come for all of you, is sharing what models you've based your program off of that maybe others can go check out, or just sharing specific things you've done in setting up your COIL program. So I really want to encourage you all to share those experiences and ideas in the post-workshop reflection. So again, we've run out of time, and I hate that. I wish we could talk for another hour, but I know some of you all have places to be. So I'll look forward to seeing you guys again. I do want to remind you of the assessment tools trial. Even if you're not planning on attending the assessment workshop, please make sure you're going into the next module, Module 6, to let me know which assessment tool. And of course, there's lots of resources there that you can check out if you haven't figured it out yet. Let me know which assessment tool you want to do a trial run of. Don't worry about the cost of it for yourself. Silmar is going to provide that. We'll get the assessment tool for you, and we'll also set up a debrief of the tool as well. Okay. So again, I'll stick around for any final questions or anything, but other than that, thank you all for joining in today. It was a great conversation. I'll see you guys again soon.
Bye. Hey, everybody.
Okay.